2 out of every 100 people. That's the number you're looking at when your eyes are green. Rarer than being left-handed. Rarer than having red hair. Walk past 100 strangers on the street, and maybe 2 of them share what you see in the mirror. For most of human history, nobody had a clue why. They blamed witchcraft. They blamed royal bloodlines. They blamed cursed marriages and a dozen other stories that had nothing to do with the truth. But now the DNA has finally been traced, and the origin is not where anyone expected. It leads somewhere older, somewhere stranger, and it stretches all the way across Asia. Before we get there, if you have green eyes or you know someone who does, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel digs into the hidden history buried inside your DNA, the kind of stories your Ancestry test will never tell you. And there's a lot more coming, so where do green eyes actually come from? Let's start with just how rare they really are, because the numbers are honestly hard to believe. Brown eyes cover most of the planet. Somewhere around 3/4 of all humans have them. In some regions, even more. Blue eyes are the famous minority, common across Northern Europe and scattered thinly everywhere else. But green sits in a category all its own. Depending on which survey you look at, green eyes show up in roughly 2% of people worldwide. 2 out of 100. In some countries, you could walk through an entire city and never meet a single green-eyed stranger. And that rarity is exactly why the myths piled up for so long. When something is that uncommon, people stop trying to explain it and start trying to mythologize it instead. And mythologize it, they did. Across the ancient world, green eyes were treated as a sign of something otherworldly and rarely in a flattering way. In parts of medieval Europe, a green-eyed woman risked being whispered about as a witch because anything uncommon was easy to fear. Elsewhere, green eyes got tangled up with jealousy and envy, which is part of why we still say someone is green with envy or talk about the green-eyed monster to this very day. Travelers told stories of green-eyed strangers as if they were describing a different species entirely. For thousands of years, that was the best anyone could do. When you cannot explain something, you decorate it with fear and folklore. It took modern genetics to strip all of that away and replace the superstition with something more incredible than any legend ever was. Brown eyes cover most of the planet, roughly 3/4 of everyone you'll ever meet. Blue eyes are the famous minority, scattered across Northern Europe and popping up here and there everywhere else. Green sits in a category of its own, about 2% of people worldwide, 2 out of every 100. In some countries, you could walk an entire city and never lock eyes with a single green-eyed stranger. That rarity is exactly why the stories piled up. When something is that uncommon, people stop trying to explain it and start trying to mythologize it. In medieval Europe, a green-eyed woman risked being whispered about as a witch. The phrases green with envy and the green-eyed monster survive to this day. Travelers described green-eyed strangers like they were describing a different species entirely. But here's the part that matters. Green eyes are not spread evenly across the map. The highest concentrations on Earth sit in the north and west of Europe. Ireland and Scotland carry dramatically more than the global average. Move across the rest of Europe, and the numbers taper off. By the time you reach East Asia, Africa, or the Americas, green eyes become vanishingly rare. That uneven map is not random. It's a direct trail, a record of where the ancient light eye mutation traveled, thrived, and mixed with everyone it met. Eye color is a quiet map of human migration written across billions of faces. And if you follow that trail backward, it points to a single origin. The question is, what genetic mechanism created the pattern in the first place? Your green eyes aren't green. There is no green pigment in the human eye, not one molecule of it. You could grind down a green iris and study every bit of its chemistry, you'd never find a green dye hiding inside. So how are you looking at green right now? It comes down to a substance called melanin. Melanin is the pigment that colors your skin, your hair, and the front layer of your iris. And it only comes in shades of brown and black. That's it. A lot of melanin gives you dark brown eyes, a little less, and you drift toward hazel and amber. But when there's very little melanin at all, something entirely different takes over. Light entering the eye gets scattered by the tissue itself. The shorter blue wavelengths bounce back toward whoever's looking at you. It's the exact same reason the sky looks blue. Even though the air isn't painted blue, the color isn't a pigment, it's physics. light behaving in a very particular way inside a very particular structure. Low melanin means more scattering. More scattering means blue wavelengths bounce back, and that bouncing light is what creates blue eyes. So where does green come in? Green is the in-between. You need that same blue scattering effect, but with a thin extra layer of a yellowish pigment called lipochrome sitting on top of it. Blue light from the scattering, plus a soft wash of golden yellow from the lipochrome. And your brain blends the two into green. You're essentially looking at a living optical illusion. A trace of yellow, a scatter of blue, and a specific delicate amount of melanin that has to land in an incredibly narrow window. Too much melanin, and you'd be brown. Too little, and you'd be pure blue. Green only appears when everything lines up almost perfectly. That's a huge part of why it's so rare. Nature has to thread a needle to make it happen. Blue is a single ingredient. Green is a full recipe, and it has to be followed almost perfectly every single time, or you end up with something else. Which raises the obvious question, what DNA code makes that exact recipe possible? So, what actually decides it? What flips the switch between brown and green? The answer is buried in your DNA, in a stretch of code most people have never heard of. And this is where the story gets genuinely wild. Two genes do most of the work. The first is called OCA2. Think of it as the melanin factory. It decides how much pigment your body pumps into the iris. The second gene is HERC2. And this one is the real key. HERC2 doesn't make pigment itself. Instead, it acts like a control switch sitting right next to OCA2, turning the factory up or down. A tiny change in HERC2 can quietly dial the whole system back, telling your body to make less pigment than it otherwise would. And when researchers went hunting for the origin of light-colored eyes, this switch is exactly what they found. To understand how strange that discovery really was, you have to picture what these scientists were actually doing. They were reading through the genetic code letter by letter, searching for the one spot where light-eyed people differed from dark-eyed people. The human genome is billions of letters long, an almost incomprehensibly vast instruction manual. And yet, when they finally zeroed in on the region controlling eye color, the difference came down to a change so small you could miss it if you blinked. A single tweak in the code, right in the switch that governs the melanin factory, dialing the pigment down just enough to change how a person's eyes catch the light. Here's where it gets almost unbelievable. A team of geneticists in Copenhagen spent years comparing the DNA of light-eyed people from wildly different corners of the world, people separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. And they discovered something that stopped them cold. Nearly every one of these people carried the exact same tiny genetic switch in the exact same spot, changed in the exact same way. Not similar changes, the same one, down to the same letter of DNA. And there's really only one explanation for that. Every single one of them inherited it from the same person, one individual. One ancestor who lived long before recorded history, whose DNA quietly stamped itself onto their descendants and never let go. Sit with that for a second. If your eyes are light, you are almost certainly carrying a mutation that traces back to one human being. A person who lived somewhere around 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, most likely near the shores of the Black Sea, in the borderlands where Eastern Europe brushes up against Asia. This person was not royalty. There were no kings back then. No thrones, no empires, just farmers and herders and small communities scratching a living out of the earth. But one of them was born with a small error in the melanin switch, an error that softened the pigment in their eyes. And instead of vanishing, that error spread. It rode down through the generations, across continents, through wars and migrations and famines, all the way to the face you see in the mirror. And this isn't a loose guess or a poetic exaggeration. It's the cold logic of the DNA itself. When a genetic change appears independently in many different places, it usually looks slightly different each time. Random mutations almost never land on the exact same spot in the exact same way. But when the change is identical everywhere you look, down to the individual letter of code, the only sensible conclusion left is that it happened once and was inherited by everyone who now carries it. That is the fingerprint of a single common ancestor. One person, one moment, one small copying error in the machinery of life, echoing across 10,000 years and hundreds of generations until it reached you. Now, here's what makes that survival even stranger. A mutation that reduces pigment shouldn't have helped anyone survive. It didn't make anyone faster or stronger. So why did it spread across an entire hemisphere? Subscribe, because the answer to that question is where the story takes its most unexpected turn yet. But before we follow that road, we have to answer something that has been bugging scientists for decades. Why did this mutation survive at all? A change that reduces pigment doesn't obviously help you survive. It doesn't make you faster, stronger, or better at finding food. In pure survival terms, light eyes should have been a footnote, a rare quirk that fizzled out. Instead, it exploded across an entire hemisphere. So, what kept it alive? There are a few leading ideas, and they might all be true at once. The first is sunlight. As humans migrated north and east into regions with weaker sun and long dark winters, lighter features may have come bundled together with lighter skin, which helps the body produce vitamin D in low light. Eye color and skin color share some of the same genetic machinery, so lighter eyes could have simply hitched a ride along with an advantage that had nothing to do with vision. The second idea is more human and frankly more fun. Rarity is attractive. In small ancient communities where nearly everyone had dark eyes, a person with striking light or green eyes stood out. They got noticed. They got remembered. And getting noticed has always been half the battle when it comes to passing your genes forward. Over enough generations, being memorable can be its own kind of survival. The truth is probably a messy blend of both, a little bit of biology and a little bit of desire. The mutation survived long enough to spread. But the journey east is where the story gets truly unexpected. Around 5,000 years ago, something shifted in the grasslands north of the Black Sea. Waves of herders began to move. These were people who had tamed the horse and lived their whole lives on open plains, and they carried their genetics with them like seeds on the wind. Some pushed west into Europe, but others turned the other way, toward the rising sun. They moved east and south into Central Asia, across land bridges that would one day become the great trade routes of the ancient world. They carried their language, their tools, their livestock, and yes, that light-eye mutation. These steppe migrants were tough, mobile, relentless. Generation after generation, they pushed into new territory, absorbing the people they met and passing their genetics steadily onward. Their impact on the human family tree is almost impossible to overstate. Enormous portions of the modern populations of both Europe and Asia still carry echoes of this single expansion out of the grasslands. So when that light-eye mutation spread, it didn't creep along slowly like a rumor passed between neighbors. It surged outward on the backs of horses, carried by one of the most successful migrations in human history. Fast forward a couple thousand years, and this whole region becomes threaded together by the Silk Road. Not one road, but a sprawling web of routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, running straight through the heart of Central Asia. For over 1,000 years, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and travelers moved back and forth along it. And wherever people trade, people mix. Genes float along the Silk Road just as surely as silk and spices did. Light eyes, once a quirk of the western steppe, seeped into the mountain valleys and desert oases of Asia and settled in. And in a few isolated pockets cut off from the outside world by mountains and distance, that trait got trapped and concentrated. The valleys that trapped this ancient trait turned out to be the perfect place to find it still alive. Deep in the mountains of northern Pakistan, there's a remote region called the Kailash Valley. The people who live there look startlingly different from their neighbors. Fair skin, light hair, and strikingly often green and blue eyes. For generations, outsiders had one favorite explanation. The legend went that these were the lost descendants of Alexander the Great's army, soldiers who marched east more than 2,000 years ago and never went home. They left their light-eyed bloodline behind in the mountains. It's a beautiful story, and tour guides still repeat it. Then geneticists tested the Kailash DNA. The romantic legend mostly fell apart. The Kailash are not the leftovers of a Greek army. Their ancestry splits off from other groups thousands of years before Alexander was ever born. Their light eyes came from that same deep well of ancient West Eurasian ancestry. The same stream that carried the light eye mutation east out of the steppe long before any empire existed. The legend got the drama right and the history wrong. The real story is quieter, older, and far more impressive. Their green eyes aren't a souvenir from a famous conqueror. They're a living fossil. a trait preserved in mountain isolation for so long that it outlasted the very civilizations people tried to credit it to. And the Kalash aren't alone. Travel through the mountain valleys of Central and South Asia, and you keep finding these pockets. The Hunza Valley, parts of Afghanistan, the highlands of Nuristan and Chitral. Green and light eyes appear far more often than anyone would expect for that part of the world. Each community is a little time capsule holding a genetic echo that rolled in thousands of years ago and got stuck there, protected by mountains that kept the outside world at arm's length. When you see a green-eyed child in one of these valleys, you're not looking at an anomaly. You're looking at the endpoint of one of the longest genetic journeys in human history. And these valleys became accidental laboratories. In a busy, well-connected region, a rare trait gets diluted. It blends into the crowd and slowly fades away. But wall a community off behind mountain passes and roaring rivers, have people marry mostly within the group for century after century, and a trait that arrived long ago gets locked firmly into place. It stops fading and starts concentrating instead. There is one face from this region that the whole world already knows. People were mesmerized by those eyes. For years, nobody could quite say why they hit so hard. Part of the answer is simple green eyes are rare enough to feel almost otherworldly. But the deeper answer is the one we've been building this whole time. Those eyes were the visible tip of an invisible history. A mutation that began near the Black Sea, rode east across the steppe, drifted down the Silk Road, and finally surfaced in the face of a child in the mountains of Central Asia. She wasn't an exception to the story. She was the story. So if you're watching this with green eyes of your own, here's what all of that actually means. You are carrying something genuinely ancient, somewhere in your family line, going back further than any name you know, further than any photograph, further than any country on a modern map. One of your ancestors picked up that original light-eyed mutation, and against staggering odds, it survived. It made it through thousands of years of chance, through countless generations where it could have simply blinked out and disappeared. Every green-eyed person alive is proof that it didn't. And here's the part that ties it all together. The part that surprises almost everyone. That mutation does not respect the borders we care about today. It doesn't care whether your family is European, Central Asian, Middle Eastern, or a blend of all three. The same tiny genetic switch shows up in a Danish fishing village and in a Pakistani mountain valley, in Turkey and in Ireland, in Afghanistan and in Scotland. Green eyes are one of the clearest reminders we have that the neat categories we use to divide people are much younger and much shallower than the DNA underneath them. Under the skin, we are far more tangled together than we like to admit. A green-eyed woman in the Kalash Valley and a green-eyed man in rural Ireland are, in a very real and literal sense, distant cousins, both carrying a gift from the same forgotten ancestor. This is also why a simple ancestry test can feel amazing and frustrating at the very same time. It might tell you that you are some blend of a handful of regions, a neat little pie chart of tidy percentages. But it rarely tells you the deeper story, the journey your traits took to reach you. Your green eyes are the perfect example. The test might flag some European ancestry and stop right there, never once mentioning that the exact same mutation is sitting in mountain villages thousands of miles to the east, or that it began with a single person on the edge of Asia long before Europe as we know it even existed. The percentages are just the surface. The real inheritance is the story buried underneath them. There's a reason your eyes squint a little harder in bright sunlight. It's the same low pigment that makes them green showing up in a different way. Less melanin means more light gets through, so the sun hits a little sharper. That's not a flaw. It's just the feature doing its job twice. There's ongoing research into whether eye color connects to other traits. The science is young. Be suspicious of anyone who tells you your eye color decides your personality. That part isn't settled. The deep stuff, the ancestry, the migration, the shared origin, that's solid. That's the part worth trusting. One more quirk. Plenty of green-eyed people weren't born with green eyes at all. Babies arrive with gray or blue eyes because the melanin in the iris hasn't finished forming. Over the first months, sometimes the first couple of years, the pigment slowly fills in. A baby who starts out blue can drift toward green as that thin layer of lipochrome settles. In a real sense, you can watch this ancient recipe finish cooking on a child's face. Look in the mirror. If your eyes are green, you're staring at one of the rarest features on the entire planet. And now you know the whole journey behind it. a trait preserved in mountain valleys carried in the face of every green-eyed person alive. Your green eyes aren't a pigment. They're a living optical illusion, a fragment of scattered sky, handed down from one nameless person who lived 10,000 years ago. Remembered not in stone, in living tissue. If this kind of story is your thing, subscribe, there are more like it already up, and tell me, what other ancient trait do you carry that you'd love to trace back to its beginning?